Okay, so hi, I'm Brendan Falkowski. Just cool at Kalen. You can find me on Twitter at Falkowski. This is my standard face. This is the deluxe version. I'm an independent designer and front-end developer, and I run a consulting business called Gravity Department, and it turns 6 tomorrow, so I'm kind of excited about that. My work's split between client consulting and product development. I do work for companies like Skinny Ties, Angry Birds, Gemaire, and Carrier Enterprise. They hire me to steer their front-end strategy. That means it's my job to understand their customers and their product, set priorities, and execute both the design and the technical implementation of responsive design. I've also done consulting with eBay Enterprise and Magento Inc. to guide their decision-making and the integration of responsive design in their core products and services. And I also perform site audits that are focused specifically on improving front-end performance. On the product side, I make Acumen, which is a Magento theme I've maintained for about 5 years. And I'm inching closer slowly to launching Mage Frontend, which is a design system for implementing and maintaining very custom responsive front ends in Magento Enterprise. I've been nominated as a brilliant newcomer by Net Magazine for my responsive work, and my clients have been featured in internet retailers Mobile 10 and Hot 100, and across the web there's nice press about me. I'm also a member of Magento's advisory board and a certified front-end developer. And this is my 6th talk about responsive design in e-commerce. They flow as a series, and they kind of follow my path, thinking and rethinking the way responsive sites should be built. Conversion is king, and analytics is his pedigree. So if you want to solve real problems with real e-commerce design problems, you should start by studying the sales funnel. There's rich data that's really easy to collect, and historically points in one direction. Customers are going to shop using whatever device they have in their hands. Merchants are embracing responsive design with open arms because it reduces their technology footprint, it increases their reach, and it improves brand consistency. Versus a proxy site or a native app, responsive design delivers the highest ROI for e-commerce, for most e-commerce businesses. And designing along the conversion path is an effective strategy for producing responsive design that improves the user's journey from end to end. We'll inspect each context and highlight the critical improvements and pitfalls. So most e-commerce sites present consistent structural elements across all page types, and I call this framing. Framing delineates your navigation from your content, and this rigidity actually improves usability. At first glance, most sites strive to appear unique, but if you look closer, you'll see a remarkable sameness and repetition across many e-commerce sites. And this isn't a coincidence, and it's not bad for business. This familiarity makes the user's needs simpler, buying a product from you. It's tempting to design the framing first because the impact of it is site-wide, but I recommend starting by stepping back to study the business, how they make money, and the product, what they need to sell. Then work backwards into the framing. An industrial supplier and a fashion house have very different architecture goals. Asking questions about how users behave before, during, and after a purchase will define your constraints while designing the framing. This discovery process not only benefits your understanding of the design problem, but it's essential for responsive design. With just a few square inches of screen space on phones, it's challenging representing the primary actions in a compact but discernible interface. How compact does it actually need to be, though? Huge Inc. has been researching scrolling behavior and found that nearly everybody scrolls when they reach a page. And just as many scrolled immediately without even looking at the content, regardless of the design of the site. And there's a recurring problem that I see with responsive design implementations that aren't built mobile first. They let the desktop site's kitchen sink of header elements kind of dominate the page on a mobile device. And this actually pushes content way down and sometimes off screen on mobile devices. And you might say that's not a big deal because I just said everybody scrolls. And it might not be on the first few pages. But after you're moving through the site and you continually get presented with the same things that you're not actually looking at, it starts to become a UX problem. The framing elements are always a convenience. They're never the actual content of the site. And that doesn't change whether you're on a laptop or on a phone. So we can do a little bit better with the right approach. What I like to do is list all the elements that you may include in the header, rank them by priority according to your business goals, group them into logical sets, and then design the small screen interaction around these groups. Last, adapt the patterns upward for larger screens. This process is effective at making goal and task-oriented UIs that are simpler across devices. A minimal store can pretty plausibly anchor itself with just a few elements. But complex sites can have a comprehensive and efficient framing too. You just need to model and prioritize the relationships between the features that you need to represent. If you repeat that process for the footers information architecture, you might consider shifting some elements upward or downward to suit their priority in your business. But after several projects, you'll notice that framing for RWD tends to skew more alike than unique compared to when you were doing desktop-only design. And this kind of sameness across sites at small viewports is pronounced, but I try not to lament that the UI is using the same patterns over and over again because you want that familiarity. Providing obvious access to common elements of e-commerce sites is constraining by nature, but you should try to embrace that obviousness as a virtue of the design. On small screens, it's a lot more important to be simple than to be fancy. So successful framing provides consistency, awareness, context, and utility without obstructing content. You should try to make that your goal with each project. Good framing helps users quickly absorb the demarcation of your site, but where they actually start shopping depends on how wayfinding is designed. Depending on the store's scale, this may combine several approaches. But I'm only going to focus on hierarchical nav because that's the critical foundation for a responsive site's wayfinding, and many of the other techniques listed there are driven more by marketing decisions. Navigating hierarchically requires devising a taxonomy that not only represents the catalog, but enhances discoverability. So two stores selling identical products may present opposing structures to facilitate a different shopping experience. For example, a DJ equipment supplier could use a dense categorical or a light persona-driven approach. Each taxonomy has merits and flaws that will suit different shopping behaviors. So a methodical pro might want to search by specifications, whereas a beginner may just want a good recommendation for a starter kit. On the surface, good taxonomy design leads the user closer to a product with each step. But it also has subliminal responsibility, priming the user's awareness of the store's content and organization. In responsive sites, hierarchical nav is often hidden behind an off-screen drawer. And in the app world, some A/B tests have shown that navigation drawers actually reduce engagement because those actions are out of sight and out of mind. When I started designing the taxonomy for skinny ties, we constrained the level 1 categories to just 5 words, knowing that we'd be able to see them across all screen sizes. This saves users a tap, and they always see the taxonomy's high-level structure. Most M.dot sites tend to use a text-only nav because it can be faster, but it's not as enticing to someone who's shopping visually. So with Skinny Ties, we retained their rich menus across all screen sizes, and that encourages users to explore them a bit before clicking into one category. Taxonomies can vary pretty substantially in shape, depth, density, and volume. And these are 2 guidelines that I always try to stick to. The first is, in most cases, 3 levels is the maximum depth that a hierarchical nav can be represented by in the framing. Imagine if you're traveling somewhere that you've never been before, but you're not allowed to check if you're going the right way until you think you've reached your destination. That's kind of what it's like when you ask a user to click through to something 4 or 5 levels deep in a taxonomy. Without any cues to reinforce that decision, there's a good chance they're not going to end up where they thought they were. And you usually can produce a deeper taxonomy. You can organize your products in a certain way that makes sense, but presenting it has consequences. A user could easily lose their context when the start or end of that tree is off screen on a small device. Beyond the third level of depth, they can often refine more effectively using attributes to filter than by diving down another layer of categories. And a deeper nav is harder to adapt consistently across different devices. Remember that wayfinding is an important time to design for discoverability. It may not pinpoint a deep category, but a shallower nav that is scannable makes users more aware of categories that they weren't initially looking at. Tangent to the depth of a taxonomy is its shape. Each branch of a hierarchy can be narrow or wide. My practical limit here is around 7 children per parent category, but fewer is always preferred. Narrower branches like this have a few advantages. They're faster to scan, which helps users absorb the catalog structure more easily. They have more screen time across more viewports, and a hierarchy that's taller than your phone screen can be disorienting. For the catalog root, having too many level 1 categories, or even a few extra long titles, could force the list behind a menu even on the largest screens. Rethinking the taxonomy might be a better approach, but some catalogs actually benefit from starting users with a single layer of taxonomy like Jamer does. There are a lot of choices presented to users, but it's actually more approachable than trying to make them understand a multi-level navigation. For Carrier Enterprise, I used a combination of tactics to keep the taxonomy visible across the broadest range of viewports. So at this top, we have using Flexbox to scale the category titles proportionally and also align them vertically. When there's a little bit more space, we add some UI cues like arrows when there's room. Conditionally, we're hiding or showing break tags to force extra long titles onto single or multi-lines as space allows. Repositioning elements to make the interface more compact. And then as it scales up and up, we do multiple font size and padding adjustments to suit the exact content that's going to fit on the screen space. So if you were to take this and scale the browser window down slowly, you'd see all those little transitions taking place. I think it's a good illustration that when we talk about responsive design, we're not saying there's a mobile breakpoint, and right here you're in mobile view or desktop view. In almost every case, we're using the content to make a very minute decision that best suits it at that point. And it doesn't matter that there's 5 or 6 breakpoints along the way. That just ends up creating a better experience for users. Some taxonomies can't be massaged into sort of a uniform or typical pyramid shape, though. And those edge cases are really important to identify early, because this is the right time to start designing for them. You might benefit from a custom interface for one branch or tree of the taxonomy that doesn't suit the template that you would lay out for everything uniformly. And your opportunities to demonstrate the breadth of your catalog do start to narrow as you follow along the conversion path, because people aren't really exploring now that you're really trying to get them to buy. And on smaller screens, they're even further limited. Wayfinding normally leads to a catalog filtering UI, and often the category and search result pages are identical or very close because users behave similarly and have the same goals in both of these modules. Catalog filtering needs to answer multiple questions for the user simultaneously. Am I in the right place? Can I filter this list? Is this the right product for me? And how you design the filtering determines how your catalog is going to be represented and assessed to users. Are the subcategories diverse? How are they shopping? Is it aesthetic or specification based? Can the list be sorted? Is it sensitive to that? And how do users differentiate between like products in the list? This is really the fun part here, because no two stores are alike, even though they're underlying using sort of the same technology. How you design filtering can really determine the shopping experience. Both Macy's and Cotton Bureau sell shirts, but Macy's UI is very generic because they also sell shoes and bedding. In any niche, they kind of have to overcome this design deficit versus a focused competitor. with a really small and uniform catalog, someone like Hardgraph doesn't really need filtering. They just have really gorgeous photography and they want you to scroll through the site and see everything. But catalogs with hundreds or thousands of products are a very different challenge. The categories can be too broad, so faceted navigation has to shoulder the cognitive load for the filtering. On small screens, Curry's responsive site renders the facets before the product list, but collapses them initially. This preserves an incentive to keep content first and see products, but still provide quick access to the facets. O'Neill Clothing uses an overlay menu to contain all of the facets. They can't individually be collapsed, but because there are only 3, it's more effective to see those options immediately. Low & Sons collapses all of their facets initially for all devices. In some cases, they have half a dozen or more, depending on the category, and this can improve scannability because users aren't yet focusing on options. They're just getting an overview of ways that they can filter. Lucy limits itself to just 2 facets, color and size. But doing this, they gain permanent visibility of those features across all screen sizes. This type of UI reduction can increase engagement on those filtering mechanisms because the UI controls are simply present at all times. Both Gemaire and Webstaurant Store retain the sidebar pattern across all viewports that toggles an off-screen panel of filters. If you animate the transition of that panel coming in or out of place, that can help users track those elements when they're shifting on screen. I guess the key point is here, just don't be afraid to experiment. A platform like Magento comes with a default filtering UI, but it may not be the best suited to your store. It's built to work for many circumstances. And on large screens, when those filters are active, it can be hard to know that they exist. On large screens, it's easy to know they exist because they're in plain sight. But on a small screen, you kind of have to guess which filters are active. So when you're on a device like a phone, it's common for those filters to be hidden by default and then toggled visible. So what I like to do is, rather than showing the filters directly, I add a little hint to the toggle button that tells you how many filters are active from the last time you triggered one of them. And this is just a little reminder, not only that the filters are there, but that you're seeing a list which is not the full list for that catalog set. Once users have whittled down your catalog to viewing a product, your design should really be nudging them to take action. If I polled the room, probably almost everyone would immediately say that the most important action here is adding to cart. But you'd probably hesitate if I asked you to name the next 5 top priority actions. When I like to discuss the product view, it's important to drive the point that we're not yet designing for conversion. We're really designing for selection at this stage. If 5% of users actually bought every product that they viewed on the site, you'd have a pretty phenomenal conversion rate. But even in that case, you'd still have 95% of your users selecting a different action. That might be leave, it might be add it to a wish list, but almost everyone is not doing what you want them to do. It's harder to design for them because they're not committed yet, and it's probably more important to because someone who wants to add to cart is going to find it very easy to hit that button. I do a little 2-part exercise to kind of define those priorities, and it starts with putting a team together that's diverse so they can kind of balance out each other's politics. You need marketing, sales, design, dev, and maybe even support. List every action that a user could take from the product view. And then divide 100 points among all of those actions to sort of prioritize them. And these scores kind of reflect your business's goals. They're not necessarily how frequently users of your site are actually going to do those things. But by scoring every possible action that they could take, even the negative ones, you make sure that it's considered. And lastly, make a note if the priority for one of those actions is different for a certain class of products or maybe for a certain business constraint, because the right time to design for that variation is going to be now. First, you define actions. Second, you define the content that informs those actions. So list every content component that may appear on the product view. If you group components that are related or should be adjacent, then rank those components relative to user actions you prioritized earlier. So on the first pass, guide your team to think in terms of small screens, like how is this user going to digest and act on the info? Agreeing on that hierarchy is easier without thinking through layout. So if the flow is logical on small screens, it's probably going to translate well to a larger screen. But be prepared for a heckler demanding that the Add to Cart button is above the fold on all devices. If you identified the precursors that a user needs to act, the fold is probably not going to be an issue. Luke Wroblewski sums this up pretty well. The call to action isn't effective before the user has actually decided to act, so there's no need to keep it up at the top of the page. And in fact, Chartbeat found that users spend the least amount of time above the fold, and engagement peaks just below the fold. So putting your primary actions up top of the page actually may give them lower visibility. So products are in the cart. Now you're converting, right? Almost. Well, the cart's role in the conversion path is assessment. It's where users appraise and modify their selections. Anyone can add to cart, but for example, making a wish list requires an account. And users know that the workaround to this is just treating their cart like a temporary wish list. They kind of have a mental checklist for the cart, and it's pretty straightforward. And an ideal content hierarchy isn't very surprising if you look at their checklist. You just define the components that go along with that flow. The manifest shows users what's in their cart, and it lets them modify the line items. Designing this responsively was challenging the first few times that I did it, and I still see responsive sites struggling because of a markup assumption. On desktops, this is usually represented as a table, which makes sense because it's tabular data, it's convenient for layout, but it doesn't work when it's responsive. Most stores try way too hard to stick with a table layout just because they're not thinking about breaking that assumption. They may try to hide columns and let the browser squeeze everything down. For example, O'Neill Clothing has 6 columns in their cart, but then they just drop 3 of them on small screens. And this has consequences because the images that are in that table are still downloaded by a mobile browser. Bad for performance. Lines are limited to just a few characters. Long words can overflow the table or go off screen. And missing headings can make labels unclear. If you're designing mobile first, you'd probably never start with a table. A list makes more sense because you can define the internal markup with much fewer constraints. Webster Store designs the exact composition they want for small screens using lists, but they still fake that table-like view for large screens. The catch-22 with syncing a dense set of touch actions into a very small space is that the accuracy of people tapping on it is probably going to be lower. And this led me to rethink the whole approach with product manifests in the cart. A user's really interacting with this information in 2 ways. They're either inspecting it or they're editing it. And when they're inspecting, it's only the information that matters, what's in my cart right now. And when they're editing, it's only the actions that matter. The UI can be a lot simpler by segmenting the manifest into those 2 different states. Inspection is usually the primary interface because it's what distinguishes the products, and all the editing actions can be tucked away. In several projects, I've used a modal to focus the user's attention during editing without cluttering the inspection view. The manifest becomes easier to scan because the intents are separated, and there's a lot of freedom here to design unique transitions. I love a motion that's baked into Relay Foods' responsive site. When you remove a product from their list, it slides in a little confirmation from off canvas. And this could have been a very sterile JavaScript dialog, but it's a little delightful touch that kind of makes you reconsider whether you actually want to take that item out of your cart. Of course, converting is the ultimate goal, and the checkout call to action can be pushed quite far down on small screens. So you might want to test placing another checkout button up above the cart manifest when the screen's small. Users making a last-minute change can then tap through directly without having to move down the page. But also remember, a user might be anywhere in the site when they're ready to check out. So if you're building a mini cart menu, it should be more than a summary of what's in there. Provide direct actions to enter the cart or enter checkout from those locations. There's a myth that checkout is hard to design well on small screens, and I disagree with that because a good checkout flows naturally. It's not distracting, and it helps users focus on one step at a time, and small screens actually reinforce that behavior. There's simply no space to waste. Odds are you need 10 to 15 pieces of information to process a user's order, so aim to make submitting that info trivial. Checkout's really annoying on most sites because every step is encumbered by little UX snags. But by fixing the little things, you can streamline the overall process. So for example, you could recycle a user's past order data to anticipate their address or shipping or payment preferences. For a B2C site, you can ditch things like company name and fax. You don't need a shipping address to sell an ebook unless you're in the EU because of the VAT commission. Or you could get the postal code first and then query a geolocation API to fill the city and state in for users. Shipping address is commonly the same as billing address, so don't make the user retype it. You can enable content-appropriate keyboards for touch devices for an email address or a phone number or numbers, so they don't have to toggle into the number mode. You can improve accuracy in form completion by defining the auto-capitalize, auto-correct, and spell check attributes on inputs. And you can help browsers autofill the entire form with data stored locally in the user's browser profile. You could provide examples or hints that reassure the user prior to validation. And then don't wait until the form is submitted to actually validate what they're typing in. You can do this natively in modern browsers, and there are tons of JavaScript libraries that can enable this client side. The point is that there are a handful of small adjustments you can make that actually make users better at completing forms than they would be. These improvements aren't really specific to responsive design, but responsive sites gain the most from employing them because you don't have to repeat those changes in an app or again in a M.dot site. So you finally converted the sale, but your job's not quite done because the user's experience doesn't end until the package is actually in their hands. How you design that post-sale process until delivery can really make or break the work you've done in conversion optimization. So a small bit of consideration here goes quite a long way. Transactional email is often the first touch point after a sale, but frequently it's ignored. It's typically just a notification, but it's no less important to be accessible on mobile devices. Litmus's analytics service estimated that 53% of email was opened on mobile devices in 2014, and that was up from 8% in 2011. There are really common transactional email scenarios in e-commerce, but many sites never change the default responses that come out of them. With a little bit of extra work, you can ensure that those touch points bolster the multi-device approach of your site, but also tailor the copywriting of them to your brand's voice and tone. Your last digital touch point with a customer is probably the last thing they want to do, administer their account. Most transactional email will pull them into something like order history or checking a gift card balance. But if you look at the way sites handle this, some of them are gargantuan. Amazon has 79 links in their dashboard. Compare that to their mobile website, 15, or their native app, 10 links. You kind of have to wonder, why isn't their desktop site simplified like the mobile versions? Or worse, how does a mobile user access the other 65 links in their desktop dashboard? This can be pretty tricky, but the responsive part of it doesn't have to be, though. I found these patterns useful for dashboards that work consistently across devices. If it's really simple, consider just inlining those modules. Bonobo's dashboard is so Spartan that they really only have to give you an option to redeem your gift card. But beware that inlining more than a handful of modules this way can actually be more confusing. So you may want to use an accordion to counter that and structure the content better. Sidebar navigation was a common pattern for dashboards on desktop sites, and it adapts very nicely with responsive design. You can float the nav adjacent on large screens and then tuck it into a menu on smaller screens. And a hub and spokes model works best if you have a very complex dashboard with modules that drill down into components. Instead of a persistent nav list, a user navigates backward to the dashboard. This is kind of what Amazon does. While designing Carrier Enterprise's dashboard, I use this to keep each module focused on the task at hand rather than on the navigation. So switching modules is a little bit slower, But to compensate, an account menu with links to each dashboard is integrated into the site's framing, so no matter where you are, you can jump directly to another relevant section. So let's wrap it up quickly. If you follow the conversion path, you can optimize across those 7 contexts. This has been really effective for me in client work to helping companies think through responsive design's application. But it might not be the ailment to your site. Just try it as an exercise. The best advice I can give is really just to stay curious, keep your eyes open, and even look outside responsive design for inspiration. If you study mobile sites or mobile apps, you'll see patterns that are built specifically for that environment that could very easily be adapted upward to work on a tablet or on a desktop site as well. So thank you and good luck.